Hi, this is the video for Monday, November 16th in 11th grade English. And so today we're beginning a week where we confront this myth of the West and we try to blow it open a little bit. And we really understand that a lot of these mythical tenets of the West are just that, myths. So today's topic specifically is that the real West isn't even West. That the way we use that word, the West, implies that we're coming from the East, which is kind of a problem because it's not true for many, many, many people throughout the history of the West. So we're going to watch this video on that and go into a quick little article about it before an activity where we try to understand what the states' names reveal about their origins. It's kind of a reprise to the beginning of the year. And all of that will lead us into Chapter 3. So pulling up our document here with the literary vocab, we're going to get through this week. We won't do any today, but we'll do some tomorrow. Our essential understandings for the unit. And here's what we want you to get out of this entire experience, that the settlement of the West introduced core American values like egalitarianism, the way that we are expecting to be treated like equals, a lack of interest in high culture, so there's a way that we reject the old, outdated modes of Europe, and violence, which is part of the myth of the West as well. The second, understand, as I just said, the frontier released Americans from European mindsets and some traditions, and sort of introduced this new idea of freedom. But lastly, the topic for this week, the myth of the West is flawed. It has a one-directional falseness. It leaves out many central narratives, and it romanticizes or dramatizes narratives that were extraordinary in some way and not representative. Today, I'm taking us to this one. The myth of the West is flawed. It has a one-directional falseness. So what do I mean by that? Well, the idea that everybody was east and moved west is itself a kind of falseness. I'm going to read through just a piece of this to set the context for the history. It's a little page of part 5, pages 5 and 6 here. So this is the way we historically teach the West. U.S. westward expansion. As changes were transforming the West, the British settled more and more territory in the East, causing far-reaching changes among Indian societies there. In 1776, these British settlers rose up against Britain and declared themselves an independent nation, founded on the ideals of personal liberty and individual rights. The leaders of this new country believed that their nation was exceptional. They wanted it to be a beacon of liberty in a world of European empire, tyranny, and oppression. But the new country's treatment of native people would contrast sharply with the ideals it set for itself. Why did U.S. leaders believe the U.S. should expand westward? Since their arrival on the continent, British settlers had taken land from Indians by trade, treaty, trickery, and violence. As the colonies grew, they took more and more land for their growing populations. The American Revolution was fought, in part, because the British government put limits on the expansion of the colonies. During this war, most Native American groups in the East joined with the British in hopes of limiting the expansion of the settlers. After the war, the U.S. claimed the land of all the Indians who had fought against them. Many U.S. leaders believed land ownership was key to preserving liberty and equality among the nation's white men. Some, like Thomas Jefferson, argued that the nation needed to be built on the backs of small farmers in order to prevent the rise of oppressive landlords. With a growing population, this would require more and more land. U.S. leaders believed their system of representative government and individual land ownership was the highest form of civilization and superior to every other system that existed. As the 19th century progressed, the national identity became linked to Anglo-Americans' belief in their own racial superiority. Supporters of expansion argued that the U.S. was a chosen land, and Anglo-Americans were people chosen to bring civilization, brought in the form of Christianity, representative government, and land ownership to the people of color that lived in North and Latin America. People in the U.S. used this ideology of racial superiority to justify the violent dispossession of Native Americans and the enslavement of hundreds of thousands of Africans and African Americans. Dispossession means taking something away, usually property. As the country's national identity developed, Some people began to believe it was the United States' destiny to expand across the continent. Many of them were ardent Christians and believed this was a destiny God had ordained for the country. The term manifest destiny was coined in the 1840s to describe this idea. So that brings us to where we are, the West and moving west. And it's a nice summation of the history that got us here, including a bit of a reflection on the unit we just finished on revolution. What happens to those ideals of the new nation? They expand. But expansion has some problems. And let's watch this video to understand that.
We use the term westward expansion all the time, of course, in American history, and a lot of our premises and a lot of the way we think about the history of this country and how it developed is based on that notion that it moves from east to west, that European civilization, if you like, arrives here with the Puritans, with the English in New England or Virginia, and they establish those institutions that become the basis of this country, and that English and Europeans and then later their American descendants move steadily westward across the country, and that's the story of the nation. It's ingrained in how we think about things. If you watch The Weatherman, given the weather in the morning, he'll often talk about thick storms out west and what's happening back east, as if we've all somehow originated from the east. Unfortunately, I think it limits our understanding of the history of the continent because it immediately sets us in a position where we're seeing things develop from east to west. A lot of the important changes that happen, particularly in the western part of the country, happen not as a result of developments moving east to west, but they're actually developments that happen south to north. Because coming out of the south, coming out of Mexico and moving all across the western half of the continent, corn comes. It produces an agricultural revolution in large areas of the country. Horses come, smallpox comes, so that a lot of the most important forces of change, particularly in Indian country before 1800, are coming out of the south and traveling north, not so much coming from the east and traveling west. When we're thinking about anyone's society, we should think of them not on the western edge, on the frontier of somebody else's history, but think of themselves as in the middle of their own world, at the center of their own universe, if you like. So whether we're looking at British people or American people or Comanche people or Lakota people, they sit at the center of their own universe. And so what they are looking out to, they're not facing west or east only. They're facing in all directions and dealing with all of the people who inhabit their universe. And I think doing that gives them as a much richer and I think more a fuller and more accurate set of views on how American history unfolds.
So here's what I have to offer to that, watching that video. Why do we call it the Wild West? Why not the North, if the perspective is from Mexico, or the South? If the perspective is from French Canada, why not East, if their perspective is from California? Might it be more appropriate to call this territory expansion instead of westward expansion, to reorient what we think about when we picture our nation being settled? And so we're going to do an activity in class to play around with that concept. I'm going to mention just a couple of things about territory acquisition. It's not important that we memorize the dates in here, but it is important that we get a sense for how territory was acquired and the different cultures that gave rise to that territorial acquisition. Land is won in the United States through war and then through purchases. And we're going to use state names as a tool for understanding the history of those purchases. Here's the map, and your classmates in class are assigned a region. Well, really they're assigned a color. I'll say pink, blue, white, or brown. We're going to leave out yellow because it's a little complicated, the yellow part. And I'm going to ask your classmates to research what are most of the state names in their region. Where are they coming from? What language? So that's the task. And your classmates will find that the majority of the names in the eastern portion of our nation here are British, actually, of course. They're acquired from Great Britain in 1783 when they win the Revolutionary War. And a lot of these words, Carolina, Virginia, Georgia, all of the words on the eastern seaboard here, not all, but most, come to us from a British concept. In the middle, all of these words in the Louisiana Purchase, with the exception of Louisiana, are coming to us from Native American languages. And then here, the blue, those are Spanish words that give rise to these. And lastly, the pink, those are Spanish words as well, with the exception of Utah. So most is the key word here of the state names in the regions I'm assigning have a different affiliation than just what we think of as American. We can find, if we look, the biography of that area and realize the ways in which the land was being settled from multiple directions and by multiple empires. I mentioned the yellow is complicated because it is, the names here of Idaho and Oregon are unclear in their origin. Washington was named at the end of the journey across the West. So it has this very British and maybe even originally American name. But they're being settled in their own way by French Canada. So it gets a little complicated there. A complication we don't really stop to explore too much. And that's what today was about. So trying to understand this idea of Westness is a myth in its own right. And that is the stem, although whenever and since America expanded its territory. So we're thinking about that around place as we read the first half of chapter 3. And that is your task if you're watching this video on your own, is to listen to chapter 3 or read chapter 3. You need to finish chapter 3 by the end of tomorrow. So for today, you could listen to it or read it up until the point where there's a courtroom scene. I'm not going to read it aloud here, but the reading will take you about 15 minutes. And that's the task. I will see you later.